All right, before we get into SQL, the language, it's important to understand relational terminology for the data model of relations that are used in SQL. So to begin, we'll define something we call a database. A database is going to be a set of named relations. And pictorially, we'll draw databases as cans. It's a pretty typical icon for databases, a can. Inside our database here, we have a set of named relations, okay, and they look like tables. Relation, sometimes and very often called a table, so those are synonyms, has two parts. A relation has two parts. It has a schema, which is a description of the relation, sometimes called the metadata for the relation. And it has an instance, which is the actual data that's currently in the database that satisfies the schema. So you can see here, we have an example of a relation. It's got three columns. The first is called SSN, the second is called first, and the third is called last. All right, the first column is of type integer, the second is of type text, and the third is of type text. So the schema has three columns, each of which has a name and a type. And the instance here, we have three rows or records in our instance right now. An attribute, sometimes called a column or a field of a relational table, is just that. It's a column of data. It's got a schema and an instance as well. So this attribute called first has three rows in it. And a tuple, sometimes called a record or a row, is an individual row in the table. Lots of synonyms here. Relation is the same as table. Attribute is the same as column, is the same as field. And tuple is the same as record, is the same as row. And unfortunately, these terms get used interchangeably in sort of database land, and it's important to know all of them. So keep this slide in mind, and if you get confused, come back and look and see which of these synonyms is which. Some things to note. In a relational table, the schema is fixed, which is to say it can be changed, but typically isn't changed very often. Adding and deleting columns to a table is possible, but it's not typical. So the schema is usually rather fixed. It has unique attribute names. Every column has a different name. And all the types of the columns are atomic, meaning that they're data types that can't be further broken down. So they're not collection types or list types or anything like that. So a typical example is the table we saw on the previous slide, the folks table, which has three columns of type integer, text, and text. Those are all atomic data types. Now the instance, which is to say the data that's actually in the table at any given time, that changes often. We insert and delete rows into a database very often. That's what databases in some ways are for. Keep in mind that in the SQL model of relations, a relation contains a multi-set of rows. What's a multi-set? It's a set where you can have duplicates. So in the example we have here, this is a relation being written out as a set of four tuples. Okay, and notice that the second and the fourth tuple on the screen are identical. But the multi-set preserves both of them. So we can keep track, for example, of the count of tuples in the table and the count of distinct tuples in the table as well. So having learned what we know about relations, both their schemas and their instances, let's have a look at some things that are illegal relations, and let's understand why they're illegal. So here's the first one. It's not the address table, it's the saddress table. It's very sad because it's not a relation. And so why is it not a relation? In this case, it's fairly obvious visually. There's a second row here that doesn't fit the schema, right? So schemas must be enforced for things to be relations. Your SQL database will enforce your schema. You won't be able to insert a row like the second row here into a table with this schema. All right, but if someone were to show you this and ask you if it's a relation, as I just did, you should say, no, that's not a relation. It doesn't have an instance that respects the schema. Okay, quick check two. Why is bad dress here not a relation? A bit more subtle. Take a minute. Okay, do you see what's going on? The schema has two columns called num. And we said that each column has to have a distinct name. We wouldn't be able to differentiate when you talk about the num column, which column you meant here. So bad dress is illegal because it has two columns with the same name. All right, last one, maddress. What's wrong with maddress? Okay, this one goes back to our atomic data types. Look at the third column, adder. It's of some type called address, which appears to be a tuple. And you can't nest composite types like tuples inside of tuples in SQL. In SQL, every column has an atomic type, something that can't be further broken down.